Hi, I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Don.
You're listening to GABL. Don and I created this show. We're doing something brand new. We're kind of making it up as we go. We're keeping it interesting and we're changing things up constantly. So you never know what to expect. Today, we're going to be talking about journalism in the 1900s. So sit back and relax and enjoy the episode today. All right, Don, let's get right into it.
Man, I'm ready. I really am. I'm excited to explore this topic, and there's so many different ways we can go. You know, one thing that I would like to ask of you, and that is, I know we're talking about journalism in the 1900s.
Yes.
But just as kind of a kickstart to that, how do you feel that that today's media has been influenced by the journalism of the 1900s?
I think these guys that we're going to talk about, we know them now as media moguls. I think they discovered that they sell more papers, they get people's attention more often when they write about things that elicit an emotional response. So rather than report cold, dry facts, which is what it kind of used to be, now they tell a story. They tell you the names of the victims, how they were killed. They tell you about their families. Like, hey, there's Mrs. Barn Wright was survived by her two boys, and it talks about her two boys. One of them's a dentist, and it's real. So you can see yourself in their shoes.
So it's more emotional than
Yes.
factual in a way. You buy into the story emotionally instead of just knowing all the facts.
I think we are really interested in stories, and even if you listen, like politics, if you listen to people talking about legislation, a lot of times they tell you a story, and they say, they talk about a young boy who had a seizure in the womb, and then now he's not eligible for health care. I remember that story going around. Because there was a baby who had a seizure in the womb, and so after the baby was born, he wasn't eligible for health care because he already had a seizure.
Wow, I totally agree with you, and I think sensationalism does sell.
You know what's crazy about this is there used to be a term. It's demagoguery, but the term is not used anymore. And what it used to mean is they used to kind of throw it out there to say that's demagoguery when somebody was using emotion to pass legislation or to prop up legislation to try to get it passed rather than facts. They say that's demagoguery. What are you doing? You're playing off emotions, and they weren't representative of real facts. They were just talking about the minority and a few people here or there. And of course, I'm not saying a couple people don't matter, but it used to be a no-no in politics. But now everybody does it. It's very natural. So nobody uses the word demagoguery anymore.
Because that word is almost non-existent in that whole concept.
Everyone's
is one
guilty.
way.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Well, I know that you are, you've done a lot of research, and I would consider you even more of an expert on this subject. So I'm just curious. Take us kind of through how journalism in the 1900s, how it kind of got its start.
So as I mentioned, it was very dry, very arcane facts. And then this man came along, Joseph Hearst purchased a gold and copper mine. Or no, it was a silver and copper mine. He paid about $400 for it, but ended up being worth several $1 million. And he was able to, when people were mining, he was getting all this money from selling the copper and the silver. He was able to purchase a newspaper. He was able to purchase more mines, and he was able to purchase a lot of property in California. So
why didn't my grandpa do this?
Right? He had a son. His son's name was William Randolph Hearst, and his wife, I forget his wife's name at the moment, but he died at a pretty young age and left his fortune to his wife and his son William. So William inherits something it's like $8 million in 1880.
So I wonder what that would translate to in today's dollar.
It's a lot. It's a lot. It's something like 60 million or something crazy is what it equates to today. They each inherited that, and it was split between Hearst's wife and his son.
Okay.
So his son takes the money, and he doesn't. His dad made him the editor of one of the papers he owned in San Francisco.
Okay.
But he didn't like the fact that nepotism got him the job. He was actually a pretty skilled writer. And he started hearing about this gentleman named Joseph Pulitzer over in New York. And he decided that he wanted to go be competition. He thought, I'm going to do something that no one else has done do something very hard. Joseph Pulitzer is making a big stir in New York, so I'm going to go challenge this guy. So he decides to move to New York. He convinces his mom to give him some more money, some of the inheritance money. And so he goes, she does, and he goes to New York and purchases a paper. The paper is called the Journal. So William Randolph Hearst purchases the Journal over in New York, where Joseph Pulitzer already has the World.
Okay, so now wasn't Joseph Pulitzer? He was an immigrant from the country of Hungary.
He has a very interesting story. So he actually has 7 brothers, and his father dies. All of his brothers but one die. And he's only 17 years old at this time, so he moves to the United States. And then his last surviving brother dies, and it's just his mom. And then shortly after that, his mom dies. So he's all alone. So he has an incredible work ethic, and he starts writing. He learns English right away, and he gets really good at it. And then but he also remembers what it's like not to be an English speaker. So the way his style of writing when he writes is very simple, very to the point, and very short, because he wants other immigrants like he was, when they couldn't understand English real well, to understand his paper. And that's one of the reasons why his paper sold so well. So he started out as a writer, and this is crazy, but he was at the Senate, or at the courthouse, doing some reporting, and just as a joke, they nominated him. And jokes on them, he actually got in. He got votes because people knew who he was, because he was this writer. So he became a senator, but then he quickly dropped out.
But before you go any further on that, isn't the fact that he became a senator when he was too young to become a senator?
I don't know.
At that time, from my understanding, at that time, you had to be, I believe, 25 years old to be in the legislature, and he was only 23 or 22, so something to that. Wow. If my memory serves me correct,
I didn't even find that.
Yeah, so good. He was too young, but because he won, he just decided, I'm going to go anyways, and the rest of the legislature just ignored his age, so he was okay.
Wow. So so after he decides to get out of politics for whatever reason it was, I don't know why, it's unclear.
Now it's unclear, but there's varying opinions out there. But one thing that I heard was that he actually got out of politics because he was interested in going back to writing, and it was interfering with what he was doing. But I could be wrong on that.
So he's writing, and then he eventually saves up enough money to purchase the paper he's working for, and that's when he purchases The World. And he pays something like only $4,500 back then, which is about $80,000 today. And then he is such a good writer, and he inspires the people under him so well that the paper starts making $80,000 a year shortly after he buys it.
Wow!
Because he's so to the point, and he's very objective for the time. And because in that time, a lot of the papers were mostly opinions. The people just gave their opinion, and that's how, actually, oddly, that's funny enough, William Randolph Hearst, that's how he wrote all of his papers. He thought, well, I'm a smart, intelligent man, so people must want to read my paper because they want my opinion. And that's what he really believed. He would put his opinion, front page, bold letters. He'll sign it with his big old signature. This is what I think about this guy, and that's that. But
so now going back real quickly to Pulitzer. Is it true that he got into writing accidentally? He got into this is what I heard. Okay, but there again, you've done a lot more research. But from my understanding, he got into writing when he lived in St. Louis. So he had just immigrated. He was a Jewish Hungarian who ends up going to St. Louis, is living. He sells his handkerchief for something like $4 just to have, 75 cents just to have money to live on. I don't know. And then he becomes is trying to find a job, can't find a job. Finally, he pays some money to go to New Orleans. And there was actually about 10 of these guys that paid some guys, hey, pay us. If you'll pay us, I believe it was $4 or $5 each. If you'll pay us, we'll take you to New Orleans, and they're having a big job deal down there, and you'll get a job. And they put them on a boat and got them down the river just a few miles and dumped them all overboard and said, "Too bad, you're on your own now." And these guys
So
took
they
off with
scammed
their
him.
they
They took their
scammed him,
money.
yeah,
Okay,
and
wow.
took off with their money. And so he wrote a letter to the editor, basically, that was telling the story of what had happened. And they liked it so much, they printed it.
Brought him on.
And that's how he
Okay.
got into the
Okay.
newspaper industry
Wow.
to start with.
No, I did not know that was his origin story. That's interesting. So after Hearst comes over, they get into like this war of their types of journalism because they become the two biggest papers in New York. So what people are doing, they're always buying both their papers.
Okay.
And their papers cost 2 cents. So 2 cents, and it was really cool about this time is they had the. It's not cool. It's child labor now, but we see it in our mind from books from history in school. There were these called newsies. These kids were as young as 6 years old or 5 years old up to 12 years old that would hawk the headlines and say, "Hey, this is what's going on. Body found in the park."
So they would basically screen the headlines,
Yes.
make up their, okay,
Some of
gotcha.
them couldn't read. Some of them would had others read some of the headlines for them. Something sounded interested. They'd make up headlines in some cases because how it worked is they would buy a bundle of papers for 50 cents and they'd get a pack of 100 papers and then
Oh,
they'd
okay.
sell them for 2 cents. So
So
they
double their money, basically.
yes, they would double their money and that's how they made a living. So they had to get rid of all the papers because if they didn't sell all of them, they were on the hook for the rest of the papers that they didn't sell.
So it was basically marketing geniuses at 5 to 12 years old age
Yeah,
group.
yeah, they found a way to make some money. All these children who were orphans or whatever their case, runaways, whatever they were, they found this work. So, also another interesting thing about this time is these guys not only. So William Randolph Hearst is considered the father of yellow journalism, and yellow journalism is really interesting because it was really something against William Hearst to say, "Hey, man, you are writing your opinion, and we don't like that kind of news anymore. We like the way Hearst is writing." And they dubbed it yellow journalism because they had this cartoon. Hearst had this cartoon with this yellow kid, and it was like a kid with like these big teeth, and it was just this really funny story. He would just be a comic, basically. And Joseph Pulitzer poached the artist that drew that kid, and so the yellow kid started being written on Joseph's paper, The World, and so they had but William Randolph Hearst kept the yellow kid. They both had the same yellow kid in their papers, and the other news outlets would comment on them and say, "You know what? These guys are driving us nuts with their silly little competition," because they would hire these people called the wrecking crew. It's like a group of 6 guys that wear suits, and they would run down leads, interview witnesses, interview possible suspects, and even make arrests.
So these guys were almost like the newspaper's police force in a way.
Yeah, basically. So the police would even read the paper and say, what is going on? They found a hat with a bullet hole in it. There was no hat with a bullet hole in it. So they would make up these things to sell papers. Like, we
So-
found a hat with a bullet hole in
So
it.
they were basically planting evidence. So they
evidence.
would be able to have a story to tell.
They may not even have planted evidence. They may have just grabbed the hat, poked a hole in it, and say they found it there, right? And, they were
Who
just
would have
making
known?
stuff up.
Yeah.
They would make arrests and have to let the guy go because they arrested the wrong guy. And they didn't really have any repercussions back then because they said, "Oh, we're just trying to help the police." But now, if you try to do something like that now, you're interfering with a police investigation. You'll go to jail.
Yes, most certainly. So the whole yellow journalism. Go back over that again. What exactly? So it was, you had 2 comic strips basically.
Yes.
That were warring against each other. And what were they saying? What was the big deal about yellow journalism?
So it was the fact that they were the 2 biggest journals, and they both had this cartoon, but they were completely different styles of writing because they were both editors of their own paper, right? And Joseph Pulitzer was very down the middle, very gray, leave his opinion. He didn't want anybody to know his opinion politically or what he thought about the crime. All he tried to do was report on the crime. And he was also guilty of having a wrecking crew and having the people plant evidence, but he wasn't like Hearst and giving his opinion and only posting his opinion. So they called it yellow journalism because they considered Hearst to be the yellow journalist because he would always just spout his opinion.
Gotcha. So basically the 1900s version of Twitter.
Yeah. But these guys are, they're the only source of information. The only way you can know what's going on is to either your neighbor tells you or you have to pay one of these kids 2 cents to get a paper to know what's going on.
Because at that point, there was no other source of media other than print news.
Right, right. Yeah, this is the 1900s. So what's interesting is they had to cut costs eventually. So come the 1930s, something interesting happened. There was a Spanish war in Cuba. So it wasn't really a war. So Spanish owned Cuba,
Okay.
and the Cuban people started resisting. There was a resistance, and they had this militia, and they were fighting for independence.
Gotcha.
Well, everybody in America at the time felt for Cuba because they thought, hey, we're a pretty new country. We don't want to be under Europe's control. And, the Civil War, they didn't want someone else ruling over them. So they felt for these Cubans, and they didn't like the fact that the Spanish were ruling over them. They say, hey, the Cubans just want independence. So William Hearst did his thing where he said, hey, this isn't fair. And he found this girl. Her name was Evangelina. So he had his reporters go to Cuba. He was paying them $5,000 a month at the time,
Wow. Unbelievable
which
amount.
is
Yeah, that was,
$90,000 in today's money.
that's crazy.
He had two people over there. And this is where things get a little confusing because there's no written documentation on this. But Hearst is supposed to have said to his guy, well, his guy first reports that, hey, there's no war here. There's a resistance, and that's it. Nothing's happening. The Spaniards are here trying to squash them down, but really nothing. No one's dying. There's no shots fired. And Hearst is supposed to have said, you furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war. So basically, Hearst was just going to make up the stories. He'll send me some pictures, and I'm going to make up some stories that are going to convince the American people that we need to fight for Cuba for their independence.
So basically, he was going to sensationalize it the best that he could to sell papers.
Yes, but I would argue, understandably so, because he wanted Cuba to be kind of like America, where, hey, why are you guys way over there trying to control this little island here? Let's leave them alone. Let them have their own thing.
So basically, he might have had good, not just good reasons, but good motivations in doing so.
American history tells us that William Randolph Hearst started the war with Cuba, but there's a historian, his name's David, like Nehaw, is Nehaw. He disagrees. He says that we started a war with Cuba because we had trade with them, and they were the largest supplier of sugar at the time. So William Randolph Hearst didn't really have much of an influence. But after the war started, this is why Hearst is credited with starting the war. As soon as the war broke out, Congress finally declares war on Spain for what's going on in Cuba. It finally happened because, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
So basically, what you're saying is that that America went to war with Spain, but William Randolph Hearst, he stepped into that.
Oh, right. As soon as the war broke out, he had these banners printed on top of all of his papers that says, how do you like the journal's war? So he was taking credit for starting the war. And there was also a Navy ship, I forgot about this part, called the Maine. And the Maine, there was an explosion and the Maine sank.
Okay.
And he reported that it was sunk by the Spaniards. So he said, hey, they sunk our ship. 250 of our soldiers, our Navy men died. And it's their fault. We need to fight in this war. So America finally declares war. So,
But he had no proof that it was the Spaniards.
no. And there's also no proof that he said, you supplied the pictures, I'll furnish the war. That is not in print anywhere. That's just hearsay,
Interesting. Well,
which is really interesting.
yes, that really is, because he is almost a villain.
Oh, he's definitely portrayed as a villain, but historians disagree for lack of evidence. But he wasn't perfect by any means. He definitely was. There were some bad attributes about him. He was racist. He was very racist against Asian people.
Okay.
Some people speculate that he was racist against black people, but there's no evidence, according to the historians that I read, that he was racist against black people. He never wrote about it if he was, but he did write about Asians.
And what?
And I'm not sure why. I don't know why exactly. I know he's from San Francisco, and I know there was a lot of crime in San Francisco, and maybe some Asian people did something bad to him, and he just didn't like him. I don't know.
Interesting. Very interesting that he, his feelings or whatever. Obviously, racism has no place in anybody's life, But just interesting that somebody so powerful would share something like that in print, where, it would never go away.
It was blatant. He was not ashamed about his thoughts, and that was one of the reasons why he was labeled a yellow journalist.
So I have a question, kind of going back to Pulitzer a little bit. So these two were warring. What really, other than the yellow kid journalism, or the whatever you would like to call that, was there a particular case, or was there a particular happening? Was it the war? What is it that made those two go at each other so much?
There's a really famous case called the headless torso that they both wrote about a lot, and it was basically this body that was found in a river, and nobody knew where it was from, but they would speculate about who it was. And anybody who had a family member missing would say, hey, maybe it's my Uncle Doug. Maybe it's him, because they never found the head, and they would both report on it. We found the hand, we found the finger, we found this, and the police would go to them and say, "Hey, where's this that you found?" Like, and they just kind of ignore it because they were making stuff up to sell papers. They were both guilty of that.
So, but were they the only daily papers in the city of New York at that time?
There was lots of them, but these are the two biggest by far. And so they're the ones that most people are taught about in U.S. history, and even the historians focus on these guys because they're so dominant in this time.
Now, is this the same? And sorry if I'm jumping ahead of you here, but is this the same trial where I believe it was William Randolph Hearst and the World, where they employed carrier pigeons to get articles to them?
So Hearst, this is fascinating. Carrier pigeons were still a thing, and because Hearst had deep pockets, he hunted them to extinction. The main reason why they went extinct is because he wanted only champion carrier pigeons. During the trial, they would use these birds to fly the notes from the people reporting on it at the court to fly back to New York so he could put it to print and be one of the first ones.
So he would basically, he had these carrier pigeons inside the courtroom?
Yeah, no, just outside the courtroom. So they would go in there and listen to what's going on in the court, run outside, tie a note to the pigeon, and let him go, and he'd fly back to New York. They'd fly 92 miles an hour. That's their max speed. They would hit it pretty quickly. And they fly back. They would grab him over at the back of the William Randolph Hearst chip paper, and they start printing.
So like 2 or 3 minutes, they'd get to them in like 2 or 3 minutes.
Yes.
Within 5 minutes.
It was quick.
So, and then how many? They were producing these daily papers. Were putting out how many editions per day?
It was about 8 editions a day.
So they'd start early in the morning, and then they'd have an 11 o'clock edition,
Yes.
and then a 1 o'clock. Okay.
Yeah, so there's a whole lot of these young kids, these newsies, selling the papers as well.
So you had to have a bunch of articles, and you wanted the latest and
Yes.
greatest on, let's say, this trial. You'd want the latest and greatest to be the headline for your 2 o'clock edition or your 4 o'clock edition.
Yeah, people that wanted to stay connected, they would just buy the paper up to 8 times in a day. Not a whole lot of people did that, obviously, because 2 pennies was a lot of. It was wage,
sizable
right?
amount of money,
They
yes.
only made $1 a week. They didn't make very much money, so it did add up.
So basically, the carrier pigeons was all to get the news first and fastest.
Yes.
Okay. Was Pulitzer doing anything at the same time?
Pulitzer was using telegrams. So they came up with a code, kind of like Morse code, and they had this code they came up with, and they would telegram it. So it was pretty comparable to the carrier pigeons, just not as fancy.
Okay. But this was all happening for one trial. Is that correct? So this was happening for this headless torso trial. That's where it kind of got started?
Yeah, because they had a suspect, and they were going to put him to death with the electric chair. And this is the trial that gets famous because it's a really sad case because the electric chair was kind of a new invention. It was a very drawn out execution, and they both actually left the courtroom because he was convicted right there, sentenced to death, and electrocuted. But there was a malfunction. He didn't die, and so they just reported that he died, and they ran outside, did their telegram, did the carrier pigeon, and that was that. The case was wrapped up.
Interesting. So, but that's kind of the start between that and the Yellow Kid journalism. That's the start.
The Yellow Kid journalism, and then the war in Spain. Right after the war in Spain, they had spent a lot of money on color printers because they just went to color. First Hearst went to color, and then Joseph Pulitzer went to color.
Okay.
And now they fall in hard times because after the war, people are less trusting of these guys because they feel like they've been bamboozled. They say, hey, we were told that this is a horrible oppression, but the war lasted 2 weeks. And the soldiers that the Spaniards sent over were defeated by the U.S. government, and the war was over. And the people felt like that the news over sensationalized the story. Well, they definitely did. And so it was rightly so. So they bought less papers. So one thing they did to cut cost was Joseph Pulitzer, the guy with less money, he decides to cut costs with the newsies.
Okay.
So instead of
So the 5 to 12-year-old boys that were
5 to 12-year-old boys that are selling the papers, instead of selling them a pack of 100 for 50 cents, he's going to sell them a pack of 100 for 60 cents.
Okay.
So the boys hear about this price increase, and they say, if that happens, we're going to go on strike. When's the price going up? Friday? Okay, we're going to have strike. And there was this kid who had one eye, and they called him Kid Blink. He held a meeting. He said, hey, everybody gather around. He got an egg crate. He stood on it. He says, listen, we're not going to let them push us around. We're going to stand up for ourselves. We're all going on strike. So the kids would hawk the headlines and then just say, the newspapers are ripping off these kids. Because what happened is, as soon as William Randolph Hearst heard that Joseph Pulitzer was going down to a penny, he went down to a penny as well.
Okay, so he basically coupled up with Pulitzer
Yes.
without saying so, and dropped or raised his price as well to sell to the newsies.
Yes. So they lowered the price to the newsies. Joseph Pulitzer started the lower price, but it was William Hearst. No, I'm sorry. What happened is they raised the price to the newsies, and then Hearst decides to lower the price of his paper to 1 cent.
Oh, wow.
So these are two
Okay.
different incidences here. They raise the price, the kids go on strike. And so the kids, once the prices go up, they grab the papers from the carriers, which are these horse-drawn wagons with all the papers. They run up, grab the papers by the armload, and go and throw them into the river. And the strike goes on for several days, and they lose 50% of their circulation.
Wow, without even being unionized or anything like
No,
that.
Kid Blink organized it according to history.
Unbelievable.
This kid with one eye. He was 11 years old.
That's crazy.
So the newspapers decided to go ahead and charge the kids 50 cents. And because it was such a big deal, they decided to buy back the papers the kids didn't sell. So no longer were they on the hook for selling all the papers. They could return unsold papers and get a refund.
So it was kind of the first punishment for child labor in a way. It was kind of the kids punished the
It
adults.
was the little man standing up to the big guy, and it just takes the big crowd to make it happen.
You go, David. Kill Goliath.
Yeah. And so the second thing that happened is the price change I mentioned earlier. I kind of convoluted the story a little bit. So William Randolph Hearst decides to starve out Joseph Pulitzer because he has all this money. So he drops the price of his paper to 1 cent. And he runs this headline called One for the Ages. And it's a real catchy. People love it. So they oh, we're just going to buy this paper. And Joseph Pulitzer doesn't want to because he doesn't have the money. But eventually he's not selling very many papers because he can't compete with 1 cent. So he lowers it to 1 cent and starts firing or letting his guys go. But as he's letting them go, he's like, hey, man, I'm sorry. I know this is really hard times, but I'm going to have to let you go. And they jump up and say, oh, that's fine. You can pay me, right? Yeah, I can pay you. Well, you seem kind of happy for someone who just got fired. Oh, well, they're hiring over at the Journal, so I'm perfectly happy.
So basically, these guys were leaving Pulitzer's paper
Yes,
to go
going
to
right
Hearst's
over-
paper,
yes.
and so they weren't losing any money. They were making just as much, if not more,
Yes.
and still having a place in journalism.
Yeah,
at that
and
point.
what's
Wow,
crazy is
cutthroat.
Hearst could do whatever he wanted. He hired Mark Twain. He hired these super famous writers because he had the money.
So Pulitzer was like, he didn't have the money.
But
was
he
just,
was such a great reporter. He was a self-made man, so to speak, as much as you can be. An immigrant, 17-year-old immigrant that came over, didn't speak English, who now is the owner of one of the largest papers in New York. And it was just incredible, his reporting. He would report something, he would export, one of his biggest things he was known for was exposing government corruption or government misspending. He would run these really articulate headlines that said something like, tax money still wet with the sweat of the working men, squandered by the people in the U.S. Senate. And people say, the money still wet with my sweat? Squandered? What's going on? So he was this excellent writer. and exposing government corruption. And the government actually had to acquiesce. They had to fix some of the things they were doing because Joseph Pulitzer was catching them, because he was involved in the Senate. If you remember, when he was younger for a short time, so he got a glimpse of what was going on. So he knew the inner workings a little bit, so he could expose it and work on it and expose the misspending.
And so he was basically writing his articles exposing this government misspending and their lack of transparency with the citizens. And so he was forcing their hand basically to go back and clean up the messes that they had truly made.
They hated him. Most people in government hated these reporters because they would report. They would go to the doorsteps, knock on their door. Hey, what's your opinion about this tax? And they would just ask them over and over until they answered. And so they were pests. All these reporters were considered pests at the least, right? And then at worst, they were making false arrests and planting evidence. These were very ruthless guys trying to make a living because they had to sell papers, right?
So speaking of that, and all, politics in general, and then New York and the papers, is it true that Pulitzer? So from my understanding, Pulitzer had played a great role in the Statue of Liberty staying in New York. Have you heard this story?
Oh, yes. So it's because of Joseph Pulitzer that the Statue of Liberty is even there, because he held these a fundraiser and had people bring their own money and donate it to build the pedestal that the Statue of Liberty is on.
Okay, and because the Statue of Liberty had been shipped over from France, and New York wasn't doing anything with it.
They weren't going to put it together because they had nowhere to put it. And Joseph Pulitzer said, hey, we can build a stinking pedestal and it will be fine. It's just going to cost some money, but the government didn't want to pay for it. They said, that's silly. We don't want to build this in New York. But Joseph Pulitzer thought it was very important as a sign of liberty. He was a very patriotic man. So, and the people trusted him because he was so honest. He was so truthful compared to Hearst, at least.
So
the people trusted him to give
Pulitzer
them their
had
money.
principles still.
Oh, yes.
And so, if my understanding is correct, San Francisco and Philadelphia both wanted that, and there was a good chance that the Statue of Liberty was going to go to San Francisco and Philadelphia.
According to my understanding, it definitely would have if it wasn't for Joseph Pulitzer. It's because of Joseph Pulitzer he held the fundraisers to get the pedestal built in New York.
Okay, now is it also true, and I saw something on this, but I can't confirm it, that he also, it was one of his editors or reporters, I believe it was a female reporter, that actually is the one that penned the words that were printed on the Statue of Liberty's table or tablet that she's holding, I believe, in her left hand.
Oh, I don't know. I didn't read that.
I believe that, I don't quote me on that, but I do believe that it was one of Joseph Pulitzer's female reporters somehow that wrote those words just kind of for nothing, basically, and handed it to him, and it ended up being something that they actually inscribed on the table of, the tablet that she's holding, I believe in her left hand.
Yeah, I don't know, but that is very well could be. He's obviously very famous today. To this day, there's something called the Pulitzer Award for people who write, groundbreaking pieces or expose corruption. Or it's still a recognizable. It's still an award today with Pulitzer's name on it because of the things he accomplished. Mostly for, number one, building the pedestal for Statue of Liberty. He was the reason it was built, and the reason Statue of Liberty is in New York. And he's also the reason for the type of journalism that we have today that the New York Times calls at the time. They called at the time objective journalism. In their opinion, that's what it was.
Yeah.
So, two other things I want to talk about is William Randolph Hearst left his wife and had a mistress, but stayed married. And I thought that was weird how he stayed married. And I thought it was probably for money. He didn't want to split up his assets, but that's not why. It turns out at that time there's an unwritten rule among journalists and among anybody in the public eye that you could not write about someone or their personal life until it was in the court papers.
Oh.
So he never filed anything with the court because he knew Joseph Pulitzer. He knew other people would write about him and talk about his marriage and his divorce.
So basically, he was doing everything he could to keep his own public persona up.
Yes.
Wow.
He's very arrogant and very, he was a smart man. There's no doubt about it. He was smart, but he was also very arrogant, and he didn't want anybody to think bad of him. So that's one thing he did. He never divorced his wife, even though he had a mistress, and they had an odd relationship. He's bought his wife a house after they separated, and still took care of her financially, just so they could peacefully live apart. Another thing that happened. So after the war, they had the financial hard times, right? They cut the money. The kids threw the papers in the water, and then they lowered their prices. They fell on hard times mostly because William Hearst decided to go against Teddy Roosevelt. He was for Teddy Roosevelt, but he turned against him because he realized Teddy Roosevelt was an internationalist. He wanted to be involved in World War II, and William Randolph Hearst was very opposed to World War I and World War II.
Okay.
And he didn't want to be involved when he saw Teddy Roosevelt was for the war. This is before Pearl Harbor, obviously. He turned against Roosevelt and was very blatant about it in the papers. He spoke against Teddy Roosevelt blatantly. It was crazy how blatant he was about speaking badly about the president. So the people had to make a choice. Hey, are we going to stand behind our president, or are we going to read this guy's paper? And just about everybody chose the president. So a lot less people were buying Hearst papers. So his stance and him being so aggressive and when everybody knows his opinion, finally
it kind of bit
worked
him
against him.
That makes sense. So basically, they're at the end, and we're talking about FDR. This is World War II.
Yes,
right.
World War
Okay.
II.
So he.
But after the war started, to Hearst's credit, he did become very patriotic and supported the war and supported America. He was very patriotic after the war broke out.
Gotcha. But just leading up to it, he was more of a pacifist.
100% anti. Well, no, what it was is he didn't want America involved with things on the other side of the hemisphere. He's like, why are we involved over there? We need to take care of America first. He invented the term America first.
Wow, interesting.
He was a nationalist and the original nationalist media mogul, essentially. He was 100% for America. Let's not get involved in anybody else's business. But after they attacked America, he's like, oh, okay, never mind. I'm for. We got to do this.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We got to be involved.
So, now Pulitzer was quite a few years older, almost like a generation ahead.
Yes.
Of Hearst.
Much older.
So he passed away, and I know he passed away on his own yacht. I think he had like a medical assistant reading to him. Like,
yes.
Something I can't remember, but it was pretty much right there at the end. He passes, and then what happens with William Randolph Hearst? What happens with the world?
Well,
where does that go?
William Randolph Hearst spent a lot of his fortune building this castle. It's almost dead in the middle between San Francisco and Los Angeles.
San Simeon, I've been there.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
I've never been, but I heard it's amazing. And he actually owns several other properties, some even in Northern California, up in like the Mount Shasta area. There's several villas. He built 5 villas. Instead of one castle, he has 5 villas. They're privately owned now. I don't think they do tours like Hearst Castle does. So they're lesser known. Anyway, he built this enormous castle. He dies. And
just to stop you right there, isn't it like 90,000 square feet of a castle?
Oh.
If I'm not mistaken, I think that's what it is.
Yeah, it's enormous. I had a fact sheet on it, but it's I didn't want to bore anybody with the details about that. You can look that up. It's still there. They do tours. It's a crazy place to go see. It's really majestic. I looked at pictures a lot. I'm gonna take a tour.
It's well worth it. Well worth it. No, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that was it. And then he he had a lot of stuff in the castle, but in 1937 when he went against Roosevelt, people turned against him, stopped buying his papers, so he had to sell a lot of his furniture, so the castle was mostly barren. But after he died, they sold some of his papers and repurchased a lot of artwork and a lot of things and filled the castle back up. The Hearst Corporation did.
Gotcha. Okay.
And they sold those villas up by Mount Shasta. Now they're privately owned, and they retained Hearst Castle, obviously, still owned by the Hearst Corporation. They still own a few papers today. The Hearst Corporation does. It doesn't bear his name, but if you look up Hearst Corporation, you can see the papers that they own.
Okay.
They own like the San Francisco Chronicle, I think.
Oh, wow.
Still.
Very interesting. I know that he just his leanings and everything. When you study him, and
he's controversial.
He truly is,
right? Because he was against Roosevelt and he lost his money because of it. He's very opinionated, but his reasoning was, I can be opinionated because there's so many other papers. Buy my paper. You don't like my opinion? Buy the other guy's paper. He didn't care.
So it was basically, he was saying, hey, this is capitalism at work. If you don't like what I'm saying, don't buy my
It
stuff.
worked great for him all the way up until he was against Teddy Roosevelt.
Interesting.
That's the only time it ever went against him.
Yeah.
His philosophy worked against him.
So just kind of in closing, we started this off talking about how they influence today.
Yes, that brings. So let's talk about today a little bit. Today, man, the demagoguery term that we opened with, it's really today. They sensationalize stories, it seems like, to get legislation passed, to get people to have a response. They say social media. I don't have social media, but they say social media, the stuff that rises to the surface is stuff that gets people to click, that keeps people's attention, and a lot of it is outrage. A lot of it is, hey, this is a political topic. Look at this person. And they bring up abortion or something that's really hot, and people will argue about it, and they'll just want to insult people and have these arguments on the internet. And it's
What's amazing to me is that you kind of have such a difference in that you used to have reporters. Reporting is kind of a dying breed as far as I'm a reporter, and now it's the common man. Everybody has a phone. Everybody has, a camera of some sort, and everybody is telling.
everybody has a platform.
Yes,
Yeah.
and so they're all, so basically you don't need paid reporters. I mean, I know you still do in some senses, but so much of our news today comes from platforms such as any kind of social media, but Facebook and Twitter and places like
Yes,
this,
and I
where
think-
people, the common man, are reporting what they see. I was driving down the road. I seen
Yes.
this road rage, and they were yelling, screaming, banging cars into each other. And so it's not, journalism is no longer somebody sitting down and writing an article.
Right.
It's just kind of these little blips of news.
Things going viral.
That's exactly it.
And one of the problems, or one of the biggest problems with things going viral, is we perceive something to be a major problem when it really isn't. So the news can do this because they can focus on one little topic, and you think, wow, there's a really big problem with the toilet paper shortage right now. They can manifest shortages by reporting, hey, we're short on toilet paper. People just go buy toilet paper. Now there is a shortage because so many people are going to buy it. So they can make things manifest through their reporting. Same thing with things going viral.
And when things go viral, you're getting a blip. You're getting a 30-second conversation, whereas even former journalism, you would get a
was
2-page
nuanced.
article or
And
something.
At the end of some of these articles, so one of the things that made Joseph Pulitzer so great, at the end of his article, you didn't know whose side to be on. He would argue both sides so well, you thought, oh, wow. At first, I thought this guy was guilty, but now I've seen both sides perfectly well. I don't know. And they'd have this reasonable doubt, and they wouldn't know.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that to me, that's what journalists should do. But I'm just Jonathan, right? Who am I? So,
But now the way we get our news, it's tainted from and I've done it myself. I've taken a picture and maybe sent a text to a friend, and it's from my perspective,
Right.
tainted by what I saw, but I didn't see the whole thing. I just saw part of it.
I think a problem is people don't research. They don't like nuance. They don't want to research counterpoints. So I looked,
Which is why we're doing this.
Yeah.
We're doing the research so people don't have to.
yes, we want to talk about
We want you
in-depth
to be informed.
both sides of the story, and kind of bring back, hey, there's nuance to this. This topic is deep. Let's not just go with the trending topic and believe the headline. Let's do a little research and see where the stuff came from.
Yes. Well, I'm enjoying it. I really am.
All right. Well, that's all we have for the time we have for this episode. Thank you for listening. Today's episode was brought to you by Tozic, produced and hosted by Jonathan and Don. We had Jennifer Peterson and Matthew Peterson, who are consultants and help us with graphic design and some of the marketing. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate us 5 stars, and don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time.